Pan-African Review is a platform that challenges assumptions about Africa and a space for introspective perspectives on matters of concern to Africans. Hello everyone, a very good morning to you and welcome to the Pan-African Review podcast. This is your online spot for African discourse. I am your host, Mahatma Ulimwengu, and today we have a very special guest for you, Yusuf Serunkuma. Yusuf is a columnist in Uganda's newspapers, scholar, and a playwright. In 2014, Fountain Publishers published his first play, The Snake Farmers, which was received with critical acclaim in Uganda, Kenya, and Rwanda. He's also a scholar and researcher who teaches political economy and history. So today we've highlighted a few of his written works for the Pan-African Review, and we will be discussing them with him. So I'm very excited for this because I think we have some insightful conversation waiting for you guys. So yeah, we'll be back with Yusuf. I hope you enjoy, and please be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and follow us on all the socials. Links are in the description. Nice to meet you, and thanks for coming on. I've been reading a lot of your work, so it's nice to put a face to the written works.
I hope you're not disappointed.
Oh no. I was saying I read a bunch of your articles, and I wish people would too. I'll put I'll put the pictures and a couple of the links below them. So I wanted to just briefly go through all of them for people who haven't read them. You have this one, Surrounded, when colonialism is all around us. So I really enjoyed that one. And you touched up on it, of Western democracy, or Africans talking about democracy and civil rights and things of that nature, where it doesn't quite apply in this nature. That's from another article, The Dreams of African Protests. So I guess my first question is, first of all, I'm going to jump a bit out of order. What is your opinion on the need of Western-style democracy in Africa? Because I was saying earlier, we had a democracy conference in Arusha in July, a 3-day conference. Halfway through day one, the question became, why do we want democracy in Africa? So I feel like when Africans start discussing the ideals of democracy in Africa, first of all, what would it mean? And is it preferable to just the basic tangibles for people, clean water, food, decent living, a dignified life? So what is your what is your opinion of Western style democracy in Africa? In that elections every 4 years, and then this government comes in, this party comes in. What is your opinion on all that?
So the question is clearly biased, right? And it shows the predicament of the colonial school, that we are all products of the colonial school, and our vocabulary and our terms of reference and our sense of imagination is conscripted to the colonial school. We are not volunteers, we are conscripted. You need to make that distinction.
Yeah.
But if you listen to the question, you're asking about form, a form of government, a form of leadership. But the best question that we never ask, the best questions is, why do people need leadership? Why do we need a government? Before we discuss the type of government, the first question, why do we need a government?
Right.
So that's normally my first question for me. Why do we need to organize ourselves and form a government? We need a government because there's one single response. We need equitable, fair use of our resources, intellectual, human, marine, land, air. That's why we need a government, so that we can fairly and equitably use the resources within our space for our own benefit.
Right.
That's why we need a government.
Okay.
That's the first point. And this is the first point because this is the standard agrarian question. This is the standard agrarian question, the question of livelihood. You have a resource. So that we normally ask 4 questions in the agrarian studies: who owns the resource? Who uses the resource? Who benefits from the resource? And what is this resource used for?
Yeah.
Right? So who owns, who benefits? Because you can own, but you're not the user. You can own and use, but you don't benefit. Right?
Right.
And you own a resource, but it could be used for something else which is not beneficial to you. So this is why we need a government. Why do we need a government? Why do we need leadership? So if you start from that beginning point, you're going to focus on resources, use of resources. Which government guarantees the use of resources for our own benefit? Which government is that? You quickly realize that form is secondary.
Right.
Because 70% of all of us on the African continent, I would say fairly 7% of all of us are agrarian people. We live on tilling the land.
Yes.
Right? We live on tilling the land. We are fishing communities. We have resources. We are not as literate. There's no rise, there's no surge in scholarship, in law, in community discourse. There's no exponential surge in the stuff, as you could say in the Enlightenment, in 1600 Europe. We don't have that. So if you don't have that, the question that we need is a livelihood question. Why do we need a government to make sure that our resources are used for our benefit? So if the African intelligentsia spent so much time answering that question, they'll realize they're not discussing democracy.
Yeah.
They'll be discussing leadership. So if you're discussing leadership, you realize, how do we use that? Who uses our marine resources? Who's benefiting from the Somali marine resources? Who's using our land? We have a banking regime. Who uses the banks? For whom are the banks set up? I could give you an example in Uganda. And I think I'll only give you the example because there's so many examples. Like every aspect of our economy in Uganda, for example, to start a local bank, to start a commercial bank in Uganda, you need to have 20 billion Uganda shillings.
Wow. Okay.
20. To start a bank, that's the premium you need to have in deposit in the central bank, 20 billion Uganda shillings. I need to do the math for that in US dollars, but I think we're talking about $200 million.
Okay.
Right. We need $200 million. I think we're in the bracket of $20 million.
Yeah.
Right? I can get 200 billion. But if I could ask you, who do you know in Uganda has $20 million?
Yeah.
Who do you know? Which group can come together to have produced $20 million to start a bank?
It says 5 million.
But then should I tell you that in America, in the US, in 2008, they had 10 million millionaires. Of those, they had 4 million billionaires.
Damn. Yeah.
And these are individuals, by the way. So if you have a banking regime which has set the premium at 20 million US dollars, for whom is this regime working?
Right.
Not for Uganda. So a man can walk from America and set up a bank here and say, I'm charging 20%, 30% of interest rate, and be taking away money to America. You know what I mean? So you have a regime which works like that.
Yeah. So
you just
the game is
so we all
So
the banks would be located in Uganda. They'd be located on the African continent. The people borrowing and banking will be Ugandans, but the profit ends up elsewhere.
Yes.
You need to know, by the way, according to The Economist, and I'm often returned to the statistic, The Economist has told us that banks in Africa are the most profitable in the world. Yeah. This is the British market telling us that elsewhere banks are profitable, but they are not as profitable as they are in Africa. You know why? Because of interest rate. Interest rate in the United States, so in Europe, averages at 1.5%. Okay. I don't know how much it is in Kigali or but I know how much it is in Nairobi and in Uganda. In Uganda, it averages between 20 and 30%.
20%.
So so nobody can do business and thrive at interest rate of 20%. You are handing over your business to the banker. This is why they're most profitable. You know what I mean? So for me, my question is the question of leadership. I don't spend time discussing form. Form is secondary. So you look at a country such as Gaddafi's Libya. Gaddafi's Libya led on the African continent in terms of women literacy, access to food and water, healthcare, education. It was higher than South Africa and Nigeria that you'd think are competing economies. And this was branded an autocracy.
Right.
Right. But in terms of majority of Libyans, access to food and water and healthcare and housing and education, women empowerment, they ranked above anybody else.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. So how do you think activists, political activists, cultural activists should proceed in educating Africans of the modern methods that colonial powers use to keep us divided, impoverished, and disillusioned? When you say people just care about healthcare, they just care about their families, we could talk about, the internal factors, but there are external factors that are hindering such progress for the African people. So how do we go about educating people as to the methods that are used? You mentioned in your articles, the IMF, or like these global institutions, global economic institutions. How do we go about discussing these with just the everyday normal African people?
When I write that we're surrounded, right?
Right.
One of my ambitions is to show that we are really surrounded. And the surrounding is that neocolonialism is more sophisticated.
Right.
It's extremely sophisticated that is difficult to see. It's technical. It's not political. It has been depoliticized. It has been technocratized. And it has conscripted many of us onto it.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, that's the dilemma of the continent, that we will struggle so much. When you ask me how we're going to go about this education, just making it visible, I don't think I have clear-cut answers, because as you know, the World Bank is in charge of our education system. The World Bank is designing curriculum for us.
Right.
Right. If you come to my country, we are obsessed with technical skills, which means we're not going to open people's eyes. We're going to train carpenters and doctors and engineers, just technical skills. We have new colonialism is very technical. It's very depoliticized.
Yeah.
Right? It's called free market economics.
Yeah.
It's called electoral democracy.
Yeah, let me
It's called,
here.
You said aid.
Yeah, exactly. Let me just quote. So when describing Western powers as of the 1980s onwards, you stated, quote, "They strengthened the push for democracy, which is divide and rule, and ideas of a free market, which is the collapse of state institutions in peasant economies, while ironically keeping all of theirs in Europe and North America, and support for civil wars." So how effective has this strategy been on the African continent? And more importantly, I think, is this a sustainable practice for Western powers?
I mean, it's 100% sustainable. It's been very successful so far, extremely successful, because I don't know how many African elite you hear chanting democracy, freedom, and human rights. Don't you hear many of them?
Yeah, no.
Yeah, because us so-called African elite, with good education, master's degrees and PhDs and professorships, discussing political economic stuff, we are always chanting democracy and human rights.
Yes.
Right? I've argued that we need to start to problematize stability. The problem is instability. Right? Part of the reason is instability. So in some spaces, stability is the problem, because you need to understand that capitalism, to reproduce itself, it needs stability.
Yeah.
You see?
Yeah.
Extraction needs stability in some spaces. Elsewhere, it needs violence, divide and rule, like in DRC.
Yeah.
It needs violence. So you make sure that it's difficult for governments to be stable. Last year, I should tell you this, in the UK,
yeah,
Glencore PLC, a very famous company dealing in diamond extraction and oil, pled guilty for flying on a private jet in South Sudan 4 weeks after independence in 2011, and they were carrying $800,000 of cash.
Yeah.
And their intention was to bribe the new government. And they said, and this is the story published in the Financial Times, and they said they sought to benefit from political turmoil by inserting themselves in contracts which had been agreed so they can break them apart and ferment political turmoil and benefit from that.
Yeah.
This is Glencore PLC, a major European corporation extracting resources to the African continent, seeking to foment turmoil so that they can benefit from it. Right?
Yeah.
So you need to understand that, when it is turmoil, they benefit. When it is stability, they benefit. So this is the trap. You see, so Libya was very safe under a form of stability that the Western powers had no control over. They didn't like that at all. For the entire time Libya was stable and peaceful and growing, we were pushed the narrative of democracy. It's safe and secure. It's rich. Its people are lucky to have it, but they don't have democracy. Right? And they bombed this country to bring democracy. I don't need to tell you what is happening there now, which is well documented. They bombed this country to bring democracy.
Yeah.
Right? So So I want to go back to the question of being surrounded. We are surrounded in a very sophisticated and very technical way that you push democracy. So once you push democracy, along with it, you push free market economics. Right? And you need to understand that democratic governments on the African continent were not born organically. They were born in the defeat of the USSR.
Right.
So they were born in the defeat of USSR. So, hitherto liberation heroes, liberators who had fought wars of liberation, started organizing elections. From Sudan, where the Bashir has just been kicked away, to Uganda, so organizing elections, and they are winning these elections by not very big margins, but reasonable margins. Yeah. You know what I mean? And as long as an election is stable, so you can get grants from the World Bank, you can get grants from IMF. But I need to tell you also, that every time you get $1 of aid or a grant from either the IMF or the World Bank, you know how much they take out? How much their corporations take out? They take out $24 for every single aid, for every single dollar of aid received on the African continent. Western corporations take away 24.
Yeah.
I need to tell you, which is a figure that I'm sure you've read in my articles. We were published, I think, in 2021, that between 1960 and 2010, Africa lost $152 trillion through unequal exchange.
Wow.
We are paying $60 billion every year for patent. We're losing $857 every year through something called it's called something with trade misinvoicing. $875 billion. Corporations are taking away this money. Corporations are able to take this money away from the continent only when there's stability. So in those places where there's stability, they use the banks, they use corporations such as Total, they use Total, banks, they use coffee exporters. So they take away all this, all right? And then they teach you the language of democracy in the open markets. You can nationalize, right? Elsewhere where they think they can't ensure stability, they send in corporations such as Glencore PLC. In DRC, they send in Dan Gatla International, which owns about 90% of the mines in DRC. You know what I mean? So they keep extracting as
you're very right.
So it's a long of entrapment.
I think you described it very aptly when you said it's very sophisticated. It's a very well-oiled machine, and we certainly are surrounded if you start even trying to measure up with what's going on. So also, you refer to Kwame Nkrumah's book as prophetic, the 1965 Neocolonialism, Last Stage of Imperialism. So from your understanding of his works, what were his greatest fear for the African continent?
I mean, that's the thing I said. He said, the later stages of neocolonialism, they're going to be more extractive than actual colonialism.
So it's coming true what he prophesied.
And I don't mean to say that actual direct colonialism wasn't
Right.
as bad.
Yeah, of course.
But I'm just saying that this new terrain is even more dangerous. And the difference with it is that it's even hidden. You can't fight it.
Yeah.
You can't see it to fight it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It even appears benevolent. For example, if they give you aid, when the World Bank says we're going to give you $5 million to develop something, they give you Uganda send annually about 300 million, every year, over a course of a period. It looks big.
Mhm.
It looks big. It looks benevolent. How can you begrudge that?
Yeah.
When they push the democracy and human rights, how do you begrudge human rights? How do you begrudge freedom of speech? How do you say, oh, they're pushing the wrong agenda? How do you begrudge that?
Mm.
How do you begrudge that you need to elect your leaders? What's the problem with that? They give us scholarships to go to Europe and study. How can you begrudge that? How can you say that's colonial?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But you need to look so closely and say, oh, every year they come to the African continent, they come to Rwanda, pick 10 of the smartest kids, go to Germany, they go to the UK, they go to China, they go to Norway. Scholarships, they pick the best. I guarantee you, every time you see a scholarship grantee traveling to the West, they have picked the best. If they do it over 5 years, they have picked 50 brilliant Rwandans who are studying in the UK. So you have 50 brilliant Rwandans studying in the UK. You have 50 brilliant Rwandans studying in Norway. You have another 50 studying in Germany, right?
Yeah.
They picked the best. So, they've over 5 years, they've taken, say, 500 brilliant young Rwandans. The best are studying in Europe. And there are two things that could happen. They could stay there because that place is very nice. They could stay there, which means their intellectual labors work in service of Europe and North America.
Right.
Or could come back to Kigali. If they come back to Kigali, they are friends of the West. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So when they start the project, they'll be like, you are man, we gave you our scholarship, blah, 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 we need this, that. You put a signature. And then you'll be like, well, they're helping us. They are giving us students scholarships. No, if you look at it over a 10-year period, you're like, uh-oh. Because what they do, they come by high school and they say, who got the best grades? They pick the ones with the best grades.
Yeah.
They take them there.
Yeah, they pick the model students, the ones who
Exactly.
too much. Yeah.
But I'm telling you, this is how sophisticated it is that it's not easy for you to say, oh, that's actually a colonial project. Yeah. But you know what happened? They ruined your economies that you can't educate your students locally. Because their banks take away money, the money that you could use to educate your people at home. Right? So graduate education in their countries is free or subsidized. You can't afford that in Africa. Yeah. Why? Because their corporations take away all the money through free trade. And then when they give you a scholarship, you're like, yeah, we got a scholarship. No, you get €1 when they took away 24. You know what I mean? So you find that Makerere University or University of Rwanda or University of Nairobi, they can't give scholarships to graduate students. They can't give, say, every year, they can't give 100 scholarships to graduate students. You know why? Because they are broke. Yeah. You know why they are broke? Because every single resource they have ends up in Europe. Like for example, the coffee growing countries, Uganda is a coffee grower, Kenya is, Ethiopia is, Mozambique, all those coffee growing countries. For every this stuff makes you sick when you know it. Yeah. For every cup of coffee, when you get a bag of coffee sold in Europe, by the time coffee reaches the coffee cup that is consumed in Europe, right? The European seller and 7 times than the African who grew it. You know, the language is value addition. It's nonsense. It's nonsense. It's made up.
Yeah.
It's made up. You tell me that if I plant a coffee tree for years, I water it, I weed, I harvest the coffee, and then when it starts being packaged and roasted and ground and marketed, you've added more value than me who, you know, planted the stem and saw it grow through the years. I work on it for like a year. You work on it for a week and you've added more value than I have.
Yeah, it's a sad reality, sad state of affairs.
You know, so they tell you value addition and they add 7 times more than you do because you've signed this agreement, this contract, this agreement, this agreement, this agreement. And then at the end of the day, you can't benefit from your coffee. And then you're poor. You can't educate your people. You can't give 100 scholarships at the University of Nairobi to 100 Kenyans every year. Yeah. Instead, the UK can. On your money. You see? But when they do it, and this is the bar, this is when they do it, we celebrate. We're like, wow.
Well, you made
Look at the British benevolence. They pick the best amongst us and they give them free education. Not free. You know, so this is the stuff that I call, you know, being surrounded. And when you ask me how we can educate people out of this trap, I have no ideas, man. Because now universities are
I was really hoping you had some ideas, because sorry, we're running out of time here. So let me just this will be the final thoughts from both of us. I was really hoping you had some sort of prescription or remedy to that, because it becomes either funny when you started laughing now, or just completely depressing when you start to think of the sophisticated nature of, I would call it more corruption. You know, it's because if you look at those Western powers within themselves, those governments, they're doing the same thing to their own people, you know, so it's just that we are easy targets and they have a history here. So it's like, why break a winning formula? So I'm always, every time I discuss this with people, I always try to gauge, like, okay, what's your idea? What would you implement or impose? So at least just for the future. And I would love to have you on, because I was speaking with Lionel from the Pan-African Review, and he had some specific questions too. And hopefully in the next week or so, if you're available, we could chat a bit more about it. But maybe we should take that into the future and just start thinking of these problems, just how well-oiled the machine is, and start thinking of our own, you know, African versions or our own solutions to these, because otherwise, you know, it becomes a never-ending discussion. But,
you know, we've had these movements before. You know, if you're familiar with the dependency school, the dependency theorists, most memorably, the Egyptian political economist Samir Amin. You know, they were preoccupied with these conversations, and among other things, they said, you know, delinking. So they suggested delinking. We should have complete rupture with the Western world, right?
How feasible
and this is what was that?
How feasible is that?
Yeah, that's the dilemma. How feasible is that? You know, it's a problem for you, and I mean, it was a problem for them too. Yeah, they struggled with it for a very long time. They proposed the idea. So they, first of all, they made visible the ways in which resources move from what they call the periphery, which means us, to Europe, which they call the center. So they move from the periphery to the center. So the resource is this, all of us and this thing together. So resources are extracted from the rest of the world as raw materials, and they end up there, right?
Right.
So they developed this dependency school, they developed dependency theory, which has been very well articulated. But you know what is funny now, that in most of our discourses, we think dependency theory is old school. It's not stuff that you can study. It's not stuff that you can teach.
Thank you very much for sticking with us till the end. Be sure to check out our website at panafricanreview.com, and we will see you guys in the next episode.